Hey guys, welcome back. Today we need to talk about something that, honestly, could reshape the entire Middle East over the next few years. And it starts with a pretty stunning idea coming out of recent reporting from Fox News: the possibility that senior Iranian regime figures may already be preparing an escape route to Russia if negotiations with the United States collapse and the Islamic Republic starts to crack from within. Now think about that for a second. Not military escalation, not another sanctions package, not another angry speech at the United Nations. We're talking about people inside the Iranian power structure potentially looking at what happened to Bashar al-Assad in Syria and quietly asking themselves, do we need a Moscow exit plan too? That is a massive psychological shift, because regimes do not start planning escape routes when they feel strong. They do it when they sense history moving against them. And if you zoom out, you can actually see why this conversation is happening right now. Iran is under pressure from almost every direction imaginable. Its economy has been battered for years by sanctions. Inflation remains brutal. Young Iranians are increasingly disconnected from the ideological language of the revolution. Regional proxy networks that once looked unstoppable now face enormous strain, and the government's legitimacy problem keeps growing every year. Then add another layer: the collapse, or at least the weakening, of what used to be Iran's regional strategic architecture. For decades, Tehran built what analysts often called the axis of resistance. Syria under Bashar al-Assad was a central pillar of that system. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen. Iran spent years creating a network that could pressure Israel and project influence across the region. But when Assad's regime started falling apart, something important happened psychologically across the Middle East. People realized even entrenched authoritarian systems backed by Russia and Iran are not invincible. And here's where the Russia angle becomes fascinating, because Moscow has increasingly become the emergency shelter for isolated strongmen and sanctioned elites. Assad fled there. Russian protection has become a kind of geopolitical insurance policy for regimes under siege. So when experts suggest Iranian elites may eventually look toward Russia as a safe haven, it actually fits an emerging pattern. Russia offers three things these leaders desperately value: security, political protection, and no extradition pressure. And honestly, Vladimir Putin benefits from this arrangement too. Every isolated regime that depends on Moscow increases Russia's leverage globally. It creates clients, dependencies, shared survival interests. But let's slow down for a second, because there's another huge issue here: the negotiations between Washington and Tehran. For years, the nuclear talks have been this exhausting cycle of hope, collapse, partial reopening, and renewed hostility. One administration pushes diplomacy. Another applies maximum pressure. Iran expands enrichment. Then talks restart. Then they fail again. And now we may be reaching another dangerous turning point. According to recent reporting, the talks are faltering amid growing disagreement over uranium enrichment, missile programs, and regional proxy activity. Israel, meanwhile, has been sending an increasingly blunt message: a deal that only limits nuclear activity is not enough anymore. Israeli analysts now argue Iran's ballistic missile program and regional militia network are just as dangerous as the nuclear issue itself. That changes the entire negotiation landscape. Because from Tehran's perspective, missiles and proxy groups are not side issues. They are the backbone of regime survival and deterrence. Iran watched Saddam Hussein fall after giving up strategic programs. It watched Libya's Muammar Gaddafi abandon his weapons ambitions before eventually being overthrown. These historical memories matter deeply inside the Iranian leadership. So when Western negotiators say you need to reduce missiles, proxies, and nuclear capabilities, Iranian hardliners hear something very different. They hear, disarm yourselves politically and strategically. And that's why compromise becomes so difficult. Now, one thing I think people in the West sometimes misunderstand is this: authoritarian systems often look incredibly stable right up until the moment they suddenly aren't. The Soviet Union looked permanent until it collapsed astonishingly fast. The Shah of Iran looked secure until 1979 exploded. Assad himself ruled Syria for decades before his system began cracking apart under the pressure of war, economics, defections, and external pressure. Regimes usually don't collapse in a straight line. They decay slowly, then suddenly. And that's why reports about elite exit planning matter so much. Because the first sign of elite panic is rarely public protest. It's private asset transfers, quiet family relocations, foreign passports, secret contingency plans. That's the stuff historians later look back on and say, that's when the insiders knew. Now, does this mean the Iranian regime is about to collapse tomorrow? No, and people need to be careful about wishful thinking here. The Islamic Republic still has powerful security institutions. The Revolutionary Guard remains deeply influential. The state still controls major coercive tools. And opposition movements inside Iran have historically struggled with organization and unity. But what has changed is confidence. The aura of inevitability around the regime has weakened. And once that psychological shield cracks, the political environment changes dramatically. You can actually see this in the language coming from various factions across the region. Israeli leaders increasingly talk openly about regime change as a conceivable outcome. Iranian dissidents are becoming more vocal internationally. Even within Iranian society, younger generations often appear less emotionally connected to the ideological foundations of the 1979 revolution. That doesn't automatically produce revolution, but it creates volatility. And volatility is what scares elites the most, especially elites with billions of dollars, international sanctions, and potentially enormous legal exposure if power shifts. Now let's talk about Russia again, because there's another layer here that's incredibly important. Russia itself is not in a particularly strong geopolitical position right now. The war in Ukraine has consumed massive resources. Moscow's influence in parts of the Middle East has weakened. Analysts increasingly argue Russia is trying to preserve relationships with unstable partners simply to avoid further strategic decline. So if Iran starts destabilizing too, that becomes another huge problem for the Kremlin. Think about it. Syria weakens, Iran weakens, Russian leverage across the Middle East shrinks dramatically. That's why Moscow has strong incentives to support the survival of Tehran's leadership structure, or at minimum, preserve relationships with whoever comes next. And honestly, this is where global geopolitics starts looking less ideological and more transactional. Russia doesn't necessarily care about the Islamic Revolution itself. It cares about influence, access, energy markets, military cooperation, and strategic positioning against the West. Meanwhile, Iran needs diplomatic cover, weapons cooperation, and geopolitical backing. So the relationship deepens because both sides increasingly feel isolated from the Western-led order. Now here's the bigger question nobody really knows the answer to. If the Iranian system weakens significantly, what comes after? And this is where things get complicated fast. Because whenever people discuss regime change, they often imagine a clean transition from dictatorship to democracy. History usually doesn't work that way. Iraq after Saddam became deeply unstable. Libya after Gaddafi descended into chaos. Syria became a catastrophic civil war. Even the fall of Assad triggered fears about extremist groups, fragmentation, and regional instability. So policymakers in Washington, Europe, Israel, and the Gulf are all balancing two competing thoughts at the same time. On one hand, they want a weaker Iran. On the other hand, they fear uncontrolled collapse. Because a fragmented Iran would not just affect Iranians. It could destabilize energy markets, trigger refugee flows, empower extremist groups, disrupt global shipping lanes, and potentially create loose weapons risks across the region. Iran is not Syria in terms of scale. It's a massive country with enormous strategic importance. That's why every conversation about pressure on Tehran eventually runs into the same uncomfortable reality. How do you weaken the regime without detonating the region? And honestly, nobody has fully solved that equation. The United States tried maximum pressure. Europe tried diplomacy. Israel favors stronger deterrence and military pressure. The Gulf states alternate between confrontation and cautious rapprochement. Yet, here we are again, still talking about enrichment, still talking about sanctions, still talking about militias, still talking about the possibility of escalation. But maybe the most important thing happening right now is not military. Maybe it's psychological. Because once ruling elites start imagining exile, they also start imagining endings. And endings change behavior. They make leaders more paranoid, more aggressive sometimes, more willing to compromise sometimes, more willing to secure personal survival above ideological purity. History is full of regimes that became most dangerous precisely when they felt cornered. So the next year or two could become incredibly consequential. If negotiations collapse entirely, pressure intensifies, and internal dissatisfaction keeps growing, we may see more reports like this one, reports about contingency planning, elite fragmentation, and strategic hedging inside the Iranian system. And if that happens, the real story may not just be about Iran. It may be about the slow unraveling of an entire geopolitical order that has defined the Middle East for decades, an order built around proxy warfare, revolutionary ideology, and regional power blocks. And the scary part? Nobody really knows what replaces it. All right, guys, that's the show for today. This is one of those stories that sounds speculative at first, until suddenly it isn't. So keep watching the signals. Watch the negotiations. Watch Russia. Watch elite behavior inside Tehran. Because sometimes the future appears first, not in official speeches, but in whispers about escape routes. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.